afternoon, everybody. So I am Anantha Nageswaran, the new Chief Economic Advisor, and it's my great pleasure and honor to be joined by my colleagues from the Economic Division. The Economic Survey, as you know very well, for 21-22 has been compiled by my old friend and new colleague, Sanjeev Sanyal, and his team of advisors who are on either side of me. So naturally, they are going to be walking you through the economic survey and its key highlights. I would just point out that as a small preview, the overall theme of the economic survey, as has been the theme of the policies that the government has pursued, especially in these COVID years. The government has pursued a four-pronged approach: short-term support to the economy, especially to the vulnerable sections during these uncertain times, while keeping a firm eye on the medium-term fiscal stability. At the same time, never to let go of the opportunity that a crisis provides to initiate structural and supply-side reforms. The government has undertaken several measures as well. At the same time, as Sanjeev would walk you through, there has been considerable attention and emphasis on process reforms as well. So these are the four pillars of the government's approach in dealing with the COVID pandemic and also to prepare the economy for a post-pandemic world. So without much further ado, I would like to hand over the stage to my colleague, Sanjeev. Thank you.
Thank you, Anant. We'll now go to the presentation of the Economic Survey for 2021-22. Let me begin by thanking the Honorable Prime Minister Narendra Modi, Honorable Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman for their unstinting support, without which, of course, this effort would not have been possible. I would also like to thank Ministers of State Pankaj Chaudhary, Minister of State Dr. Bhagwat Karat, Finance Secretary Dr. Somnathan, DEA Secretary Mr. Ajay Seth, Revenue Secretary Mr. Tarun Bajaj. An effort like this, as you can all imagine, meant that a large number of people contributed to this from across the government with all kinds of inputs. But of course, the bulk of the heavy lifting had to be done by the Economic Survey, which puts together this document. And I could not have done without the support of all the advisors on this table, Manisha, Chandni, Rajiv, and of course all the officers and consultants of the Economic Division, and not just the ones that did the writing, but also the translators, those who did the design, the formatting, the administrative staff, all of whom were in office over the last few weeks till very late. And this has been a particularly difficult year to do this, as you can imagine, given the problems we had with Omicron. There were many members of our team who at different points were down with Omicron or some other illness, or had close family members who were affected. So there was many disruptions, and many people had to work from home in very difficult circumstances. So let me say that a very big thank you to all of you. Many of them are sitting right here in front of me, so if you can raise your hands and wave. Please, a big round of applause for them, because they put in a really big effort. Finally, let me welcome my dear friend, Dr. Anantha Nageswaran, to the Ministry of Finance as the new Chief Economic Advisor. So a big round of applause for him as well. So, as many of you may have noticed, the Economic Survey has gone through another change in its format. We will be going for a different format, but it is important in this context to go through a very quick history of this document. So the Economic Survey as a document has its origins in the early 1950s when it started out as part of the budget papers. So it is not published separately, but as a part of the budget papers. And the earliest one that I could find is from 1957. It was a very short document, only 38 pages long. And it was basically a descriptive document. It had some trends of recent trends, but not much by way of analysis and almost nothing by way of recommendations and so on. So it was a very simple document, but nevertheless, that's where it started out. You can see on the left image, one of the earliest ones that we have images for. This is the one from 5960. Now, through the course of the 60s, the document became a lot more substantial. A lot more data, charts, tables, etc. began to be added to it. You also began to have a Hindi translation at that stage in the 60s. And by about the early 70s, this became a more substantial document, about 150 odd pages. So you have on the right an image from 1973. Now, through the 70s and 80s, this document took a life of its own. It was by this time being presented as a separate document a day before the budget. So by now, it has a character of its own. A lot more tables and charts are added. A statistical appendix is added in the end. And it begins to take on the form that is now much more familiar to what you would think of as an economic survey. I've got the one from 85, 86. Many people in this room will perhaps be familiar with that cover and may have studied it when in university. Now, the economic survey of 91, 92, as you can imagine, was particularly awaited because that was during the crisis of 91, and you had the reforms and so on. And this is the first time that it appeared in 2 volumes. The first volume was a very thin volume, only about, if I remember, some 30-odd pages, but it was the first time that 2 volumes were published. The second volume was much more traditional sectoral analysis, and in the following years, it reverted to being back a single volume. But the document kept growing, and of course, with the advent of computers, the graphics and so on improved very dramatically. So by, as you can see, 2001, 2002, the covers become much more colorful and so on. Then, during the global economic crisis, the document, a few extra thematic chapters were added to it by the then Chief Economic Advisor, Dr. Arvind Vimani, perhaps to explain the predicament of that time. So you began to see a shift, somewhat of a shift from the purely sectoral approach to adding more themes. And it became a longer document, certainly by 2011-12, that you have on the screen. It was by this point almost 500 pages long. Now, it then became split into 2 volumes in 2014, but that was a split in 2014 into a text volume, which was mostly done in a sectoral format, and a statistical appendix volume. So there was 2 volumes, but in this format. But in the subsequent years, it ended up with a volume 1 and a volume 2. The first volume tended to have thematic chapters, and the second had the more traditional chapters from the sectoral type chapters. That has now been changed in this economic survey, and this is what it looks like. There is a volume 1, or you can call it the text volume, the economic survey itself. That is the main volume, which we just released. But there is a second volume, which is the statistical appendix, and it's been given a character of its own. It's been refreshed. Many old tables have been removed. New tables have been added. For example, new kinds of data like GST, IGST, and so on have been added. There's a whole new section on high-frequency indicators as well, in line with some of the thinking that I will now talk about. Now to the content of the economic survey of this year. Now, one of the clear points we make right up front in the survey is that there's been a revival of economic activity to pre-pandemic levels in the year 21-22. This shows through in the national accounts, And it shows through a whole bunch of high-frequency data that we have. I've just, for illustration, put the e-way bill collection, and you can see that there was a big contraction during the national lockdown last year, then a sharp revival, a more shallow slowdown during the second wave. So even though there was the health cost of the second wave was much more severe, the economic cost of it, by almost all accounts, was much milder. But there was an impact, and then a subsequent revival. So where does that leave us? Well, as you know from the advanced estimates, the economy this year is estimated to have grown by 9.2% after a contraction of 7.3% in the previous year. And you can see on the slide on the right that it is now a little bit above where it was in terms of economic activity, where it was before the pandemic. So in other words, we have now grown past the pre-pandemic level. What does it mean in terms by sector? This sectorally, we tend to look at it as a GVA, or gross value added perspective. And you can see what happened to different sectors. And the very last column is a comparison with the pre-pandemic era, which is 2019-20. And you will see that the agriculture sector, not surprisingly, this is the sector that was the least affected by lockdowns of various kinds. So this is a sector that grew even in 2021 and then again in 21-22. So in that sense, it is now a little short of 8% above where it was in pre-pandemic phase. The industrial sector did go through a contraction, but then it went through a significant revival as well. And now it is about 4.1% above pre-pandemic levels. And the subsectors went through a slightly different trends, but as you can imagine, the utility sector didn't go through the same kind of contraction because obviously water supply, electricity, etc. don't get shut down during a lockdown. But manufacturing, construction, and other such sectors did go through a contraction and then a revival. In fact, if you look at the quarterly data, they will go through this downturn, sharp downturn, revival, shallow downturn, and flatter, and then a more sustained revival. I scratched my head thinking about what would be a good letter of the alphabet to describe this. And after a lot of discussions with the best minds, we thought that the best we could do was maybe a tilted W. I know it's very awkward, but so I didn't bother to use it. Now moving on to the services sector. Now the services sector is definitely the sector that was most affected by the lockdowns. And you can see that it is just a little short of where it was pre-pandemic. But I think the real story is not in the headline number, but in the subsectors. And you can see finance, real estate, professional services, or public administration, both of these have actually gone back to pre-pandemic levels. But as you can imagine, the contact-intensive subsectors of services have been much more severely affected. And you can see that it is this segment, which includes, of course, tourism, travel, hotels, those kinds of sectors, that is still continues to be below pre-pandemic levels at about 91.5. So it's about 8.5% below where it was pre-pandemic. So this is clearly a sector that is still impacted. Overall GVA at basic price is about 1.9% above where it was pre-pandemic. Now we can do the same exercise from the demand side, looking at real GDP growth, and you can again see that when you look at total consumption, it is just shy of where we were before the pandemic. Government consumption, of course, has been reasonably strong, not surprising, given a lot of spending that's happened, particularly on the health front, but on other kinds of things, including providing safety nets to vulnerable sections of society and of the business sector. So private consumption, on the other hand, still lags. Now, if you combine this private consumption number, which is at 97.1% of the pre-pandemic level, and the discussion in the previous slide, you can see where the hit really is, because this is all those contact-intensive services where obviously spending is constrained because you are under lockdowns of various kinds. In fact, we are just gone through one thanks to Omicron just in the last few weeks. Meanwhile, the gross fixed capital formation has recovered past the 1920 level. The key point here, of course, is that a lot of this is driven by government spending on capex, particularly on infrastructure, which we will also return to a little later in the fiscal segment that we will discuss. Exports have been a major driver of growth, and you can see they are now very significantly above the pre-COVID level. But of course, imports have also been very strong. Overall, GDP is 1.3% above where it was pre-pandemic. This is in line with what we saw calculating from the GVA perspective. Now, of course, it's all very good for an economy to have recovered like this, but we continue to remain in uncertain times. There are geopolitical risks bubbling up in various parts of the world. Oil prices have spiked up just in the last few days, in fact. There's going to be very likely a withdrawal of global liquidity by major central banks, and that is something we have accounted for. So taking all these uncertainties into account, it is important to see whether our macroeconomic indicators can provide us a bit of a buffer through this recovery process. The first one we looked at was the fiscal performance, and you can see that the data that we have available for April to November 2021, which is the data that is publicly available with all of you, and it's not surprising from what you have probably been following anyway, that there has been a very sharp increase in both tax and non-tax revenue collections of the government. And it is not just the case that these collections are high on a year-on-year basis from the pandemic hit numbers of 2021. They are actually very significantly above what they were pre-pandemic as well. So this is real, genuine, boost to revenue collections of the government, which is great because this allows support for another leg of the government strategy, which is support for capital expenditure. And you can see that capital expenditure is now a level above where it used to be pre-pandemic. I mean, this was something that was ramped up very sharply through the second half of the last financial year as part of the demand push, but has, as you can see, been quite strong ever since. And so this is a very important part of the government strategy to both support demand on one side, but also create supply-side assets for the future. Now, where does that leave various deficits? Well, as you can see, the numbers available for April to November, obviously the estimates for the full year you will get tomorrow morning, but the publicly available numbers for April to November clearly show that the fiscal deficit is not only below what it was for last year for the same period, but also below what it was in the pre-pandemic phase in nominal rupee terms. This is also true, by the way, of the primary deficit, which is very substantial. It's half of what it was in the pre-pandemic period in rupee crore terms. So this is a very substantial correction. And of course, if you think of it in terms of percentage budget estimate, you can see that traditionally, because a lot of the revenue in India tends to be front-loaded, the fiscal deficit of the first half or the first, in this case, April to November period, tends to be above the overall full year, and then in the course of the next few months it comes down. But you can see that April to November 2021 has been particularly good, with numbers coming in at just 46% of the full year number. So this is a particularly good performance. Now moving on to the financial sector. Obviously this is always an area of macroeconomic risk and stability that we need to look at. There were many commentators who had expressed the fear during the last 2 years that the financial system would become very stressed as a result of this shock, this pandemic-related shock. And you can see, however, that this sector actually has weathered it rather well. Whether it's the gross NPA level or the net NPA level, both of them have continued to steadily decline through the last couple of years. And this is even true after the initial IBC moratorium was removed. So this has not gone through a spike after that. And the banks continue to increase their capital adequacy ratios. So they are becoming much more better capitalized. So this is important, that even if there's some later lagged impact of the pandemic on the economy, the banks are well capitalized, and they seem to have taken the pandemic shock in their stride. Now, of course, the financial sector is not just about stability, it's also about growth. And the last couple of years did see credit slow down significantly. But in the very latest numbers, you can see that it has begun to tick up again. But the good news is, because you have a banking system that is well capitalized, when the demand for credit arises, this banking system is in a position to provide that credit where appropriate. Also important to note how strong the capital markets have been. And you can see the amount of resource mobilization that has happened through IPOs through this year. In fact, just the April to December number is good enough to reach all-time records. So we've already crossed all-time records in the first 3/4 of the year. So not even taking the last 3 months, we are already in record territory. Now, of course, when people hear about this, they tend to have in their minds that what we are really talking about is all the big corporates or the unicorns that everybody likes talking about these days in the media. But the fact is, what you are witnessing here is a change in risk appetite and animal spirits in the economy, which is very much widespread across the country and at every level, and particularly showing through in this field of startups. So here I have two maps. The one on the left is just from 5 years ago. It shows new startups in India as of the year 2016-17. These are not just any company that happened to have been established. These are these are companies registered with DPIIT as startups using certain criteria. So they are proper startups. And you can see in the year 16-17, there were these few sort of concentrations near Bangalore, Hyderabad area. There was one concentration near Mumbai, and then one in the Delhi NCR area. But most of the country really didn't have a startup culture. Now, 5 years later, that has completely changed. And this is, by the way, data as on 22nd of December. We have not even finished the year. And you can see a complete change. There are at least 555 districts in the country with at least one startup. This is quite incredible. And you can see it's scattered across the country. There's obviously the usual suspects, Delhi NCR area. There is Mumbai, Pune area. There's another hub near Ahmedabad. And I mentioned Bangalore. But you can see that there are hubs all across the country, whether it's in even near Patna and Lucknow, there are startups popping up, and even in parts of the country that, not historically associated with startup culture. You can see even in the Northeast, there are several of them popping up. So this is a real change in some ways in the animal spirits at a grassroots level. Now to move on to the next stability indicator. This is the external sector. Again, the balance of payments remained in a healthy positive territory throughout this episode. There were obviously ups and downs on individual segments, whether it's the current account or the capital account. But overall, even during the difficult times of the lockdown, when the capital flows may have been a little volatile, the current account moved into a large surplus in the first quarter of 2021. And since then, of course, capital flows have been doing very well. And although the current account has moved into a small deficit because of a revival in imports, which is natural. If your economy revives, your imports will also revive, and oil prices too. But you can see that capital flows have been so strong that we have a very healthy balance of payments surplus throughout the period. And this has allowed for an accumulation of foreign exchange reserves. We are now at about 634 billion reserves, one of the highest in the world, and equivalent to about 13.2 months of import. So very, very comfortable. you compare it with whether our external debt servicing requirements or any other ratios, you will see we are very, very comfortable on the external front. Now to move to inflation. Now inflation, as you can imagine, during the year 2021 was very much reflected the disruptions caused by the lockdowns, the supply chain disruptions. So not surprisingly, the supply chain disruptions meant the CPI went up, whereas piling up of inventory at the wholesale meant that that actually went into negative territory. So since things were opened up into this year, you saw the CPI come back into the tolerance band, and it remains in the tolerance band as of the latest reading of at 5.6%. But the WPI has popped back up and is in double digits. Now, some of that, of course, is a reflection of the low base from last year. So that will, of course, wear itself out. But we do need to be concerned here in India about the fact that there is significant imported inflation, particularly from energy prices, that will be something we need to watch out for. Now, as part of the economic survey, we did some analysis of things that very often become matters of debate quite often, which is tomato and onion prices. And you can see why that is the case, because tomato and onion prices, and those of potatoes as well sometimes, go through these massive spikes. So the question is, why do they go through these massive spikes? And so we did a little bit of analysis here, and we found something quite interesting. First of all, this one is for tomatoes. There is a lot of seasonality in all of this. And you can see that during the months of February, March, April, the prices of tomatoes decline every year. And then in the months of July, August, and then another spike somewhere in October, November, they go up. And every year this becomes a matter of debate. This is a cyclical trend because of the harvesting cycle, and we should be able to see through it in different ways. In addition to that, you also have irregular components in terms of weather shocks. So there is a section in the economic survey. Please read it for those who are interested in this. We have something similar also for onion prices, and you can see there is a lot of seasonality here as well. Every year it goes down during the months of April, May, June, and you will see farmers complaining, and then later in the year when it goes up, consumers complaining about this. And again, of course, the weather shocks also play an important role in all of this. Of course, the solution to that, this is to develop the supply chains that and cold storage facilities that can smoothen this out, and not to mention financial instruments that can allow for futures so that we can smoothen these things out. But just to show you why this happens every year. Now, this is something that will not be of any surprise. An important risk factor these days, a macroeconomic risk factor these days, is waves of COVID pandemic that seems to come through. So not surprisingly, vaccination status is actually a macroeconomic stability indicator, and you can see that we have done rather well over the last year, and this data is as of 16th of January, because that marked a full year cycle. And you can see that we have done rather well in terms of percentage of adult population with the first dose. We have now crossed 93%. Percentage of adult population with second dose was about 70% at the time of writing. This is moving so fast that by now this has already moved on from this. Now, it is traditional that we present an outlook and a forecast for the next financial year. So the growth for 2022-23, we argue in the economic survey, will be supported by widespread vaccination coverage, gains from a large number of supply-side reforms, easing of regulations, robust export growth, availability of fiscal space to ramp up capital spending, and so on. And so we expect that there will be a fairly robust growth into the next year, and we forecast that India's GDP will grow in real terms by 8 to 8.5% in 22-23. Now, this projection is based on a bunch of assumptions. All projections are always based on some assumptions, and it's important to be absolutely transparent about what they are. So what we have said here, that one assumption is that there will be no further debilitating pandemic-related economic disruption. So you may get next waves, but there will be no debilitating lockdowns. That's an assumption. We assume a normal monsoon. We do allow for significant withdrawal of global liquidity by major central banks, although we hope that they will be broadly orderly, but there will be a withdrawal of such liquidity. Oil prices in the range of 70 to 75. Now somebody may say that how can you assume this when oil prices are at 90? Well, just remind you that just 18 months ago it was below 20. So we have put what we thought was a reasonable assumption. And of course, the global supply chain disruptions will remain in play for much of the next financial year, but will slowly ease towards the end. So we do allow for significant disruptions to continue for much of next year, but easing over time. Now, just to put it in the context of some of the international forecasts that came through, the latest one came from the IMF just 5 days ago. And you can see, first of all, that India is one of the very few countries where, in fact, pretty much almost the only country where the forecast has been increased. Their forecast for that year went up from 8.5 to 9.0. This is in the context, as you can see, very substantial reductions for almost every other country. I would also like to note here that even with our more conservative forecasts from the economic survey, we would still be the world's fastest growing economy.